Okay, thank you so much. Well, really knows what they are getting into when they sign up to get married? My husband and I did a pre-Cana light version. Pre-Cana is a Catholic consultation for couples, but I never was confirmed in the Catholic Church, and my husband was in the Army National Guard. So we opted to go with an Army chaplain. We met with the Army chaplain a few times before our wedding date, answered the questions about our goals satisfactorily, and we were on our way to our wedding day. August 30th, 2008, on a humid, hot day in Connecticut, my husband and I said our I do's in front of 270 family and friends and many, many mosquitoes. A nearby river seemed like a perfect overlook when we booked the venue, but we realized during our ceremony when mosquitoes were climbing up the chaplain's nose, it might have had its downsides too. Luckily, Chaplain Nutt's Army training came in handy and he paid no attention to the mosquito that took refuge on his nose and then in his nose. I might have forgotten some of the words I had to say as I was watching this unfold, but luckily my soon-to-be husband, Scott, would help me through it all, like he always has. A few boogery kisses later, I was sobbing happy tears and couldn't control myself. We were married. It would be the very first of many boogery kisses that my husband has received from me, that lucky lad. Our wedding venue by the river also had one other thing we didn't account for. We went into the venue for our reception, had our meal, listened to my brother-in-law Stephen and my maid of honor Kate give wonderful speeches, did our customary dances, and then started dancing the night away. About an hour later, my husband and I noticed a good deal of our guests were missing. Was there a better party than ours? To note, both my side of the family and his side of the family forgot to bring us the rehearsal dinner after the rehearsal and started drinking without us the night before, so anything was possible. My husband and I started to see police cars coming into the parking lot. We looked at each other, and Scott and I just shrugged. I had used the bathroom and noticed that there was a faint smell of upchuck in the bathroom. What in the world? I told him, and he looked at our bridesmaids, and they were all accounted for. So it wasn't someone in the bridal party. Lights started to be shown on the river behind us, and lights were flashing all over the parking lot. Scott and I decided to look at the people who were seated and danced anyway. About 20 minutes later, the lights disappeared and everyone returned to the party. We learned the next day that one of our guests got so inebriated, but no one could find her. The police and the firemen were called, and so there was a search in the river for her. She was found asleep by the dumpster. Scott and I have pretty much had a funny story for much of our married lives. He has been the one to help me see the better side of things or coach me through the hard. Right before we were married, Scott received news that he would be deployed in 2009 or 2010 to Afghanistan. He was in the Army National Guard Reserves, so he would go to things if called up. He did the whole 1 weekend a month, 2 weeks a year. Right before we met, he had gone to basic training, and I had met him right after. He had a civilian job, but he wanted to give back to his country. His brother Stephen was also in the Army National Guard. Stephen had served in Iraq, but he would also be going to Afghanistan as well at the same time. Scott and Stephen were not in the same unit, but were in the same brigade. I lost my job in early 2009 when the market took a digger, and soon after, Scott and I found out we were pregnant. Well, I was carrying the baby, and he had to carry all of my emotions that went with it. Pregnant mom and deploying husband and wife who has chronic anxiety makes for some craziness and a lot of boogers. At 8 weeks, I started having extremely heavy bleeding, and I went to my doctor. He said the baby was gone, and I just sobbed. And I hit a parked car in the parking lot. I was a complete mess, and my husband's helped me up and took the phone call from the person whose car I hit and explained the situation. I wasn't really satisfied with the doctor saying the baby was gone. Whether it was stubbornness or anger or just complete denial, I told Scott that I wanted a second opinion. Scott said okay, and we went to a different hospital. The first doctor wouldn't do an ultrasound, but the second hospital did, and baby's heart was thunking away. The day I switched doctors, I was so glad I did. At 20 weeks, we had an ultrasound and then for the anatomy scan of our baby. We found out that we were having a boy, but that he also had markers for trisomy 13. What did we want to do? My emotions were a wreck, but Scott handled it pretty well. He said, "We're going to continue on." Scott and I went on our baby moon, which was also going to be our last vacation before he deployed. We went to Chicago, visited the USO, and got a few free fun things for the baby. After returning to Connecticut, we had the anatomy scan again, and the markers for trisomy 13 had disappeared. In October, Scott had a lot of pre-deployment drills, so I was left home alone with our cute bulldog, Roxy, and we call her our dogder. And we would meet my mom and a friend, who was also pregnant, for lunch. Sometimes in the midst of this, I ended up contracting H1N1. Scott came home from his first pre-deployment drill on a Sunday, and Monday headed into work. I was sleeping at the time he left, so he thought I was just a pregnant lady and let me sleep. I couldn't get out of bed, and my parents came to check on me. They ended up calling the ambulance that took me to the hospital, where the first doctor said my baby had no chance. I could barely breathe and was having a really hard time walking. I was put in an isolated room, and the nurses and the staff came in with what I thought were beekeeper suits. I was transferred into the maternity ward one day and then the ICU. I would later find out that I was one of 280 pregnant women in 2009 that had contracted H1N1. 56 of them had died. Scott would come to visit me every day. The doctor who saw me at intake would visit me as well and really, truly cared. And my new awesome obstetrician, Dr. Ree, came in morning and night to check on me as well. I was released from the hospital finally on Halloween of 2009. Those are things that test marriages. There were no boogery kisses there. Scott had a few more weeks of civilian work to get through before he headed off to war, and it was awful for me and him. I hung out at home, biting away my time, and he worked. Then he was shipped off to pre-deployment. I started to have contractions 2 days after Thanksgiving, and my mom drove me to the hospital. The Red Cross, that was supposed to be who I notified when I went into labor, told me that until I had the baby, they would not actually send for my husband. Since everyone in my husband's unit really liked him and they knew me and all of my medical issues, they sent him back from Indiana to Connecticut to hopefully get him in time for our son's birth. It wasn't an easy trip. My husband went from Indiana to Atlanta, then Connecticut. Of course, that was the most direct route possible. My husband's cell phone had also broke in this time, so he could only receive calls and not place them. So in the airport in Atlanta, he purchased a new phone and ran through crowds of kids, people, and civilians to make his connecting flight, all while people were trying to thank him for his service. He finally arrived at the hospital. He was wearing cold weather gear, and the hospital was pretty warm. He passed out from 27 hours of flying and running through crowds. The nurses came to check on me and told me that the baby was ready to come out. Me, in my drug-induced state, decided that it would be wise to scream, "Fire drill!" I don't do very well with drugs. My husband woke up and started looking at all the apparatuses that were around him and said, "Okay, let's move you out of here." And the nurses were shuttling in and out, and he looked confused. He said to them, "She just yelled fire drill. We need to get her out of here." The nurses laughed at my husband and said, "Yeah, your wife doesn't do very well with drugs. She saw dancing pandas a while ago. There's no fire. The baby's ready to come out. I think that's what she meant." My husband was ready to help me figure out how to get the baby and me out of the hospital if need be. We had our baby safely in the hospital at 2:51 a.m. My husband was able to be there for 10 days before he had to go back to pre-deployment. I had horrible postpartum depression. We were able to communicate using the BlackBerry cell phone while he was in Afghanistan. My son and I made it through weeks and months sending my husband care packages to my husband and my brother-in-law, who was also overseas. We did a few phone calls, but the connection was very spotty, mostly text messages. Then on August 22nd, 2010, it was a very rainy day in Connecticut, and I felt very on edge the whole day. My son and I had moved into our condo after staying with my parents for most of the year. I had a feeling I needed to get back to our condo and get it ready for Scott to come back home. Late in the evening, I received a call from my father-in-law saying they had a visit from two bereavement soldiers telling them that my brother-in-law, Stephen, had been killed in action in Afghanistan. Scott, my husband, had been told and was on his way home, but we didn't have a way to contact him, and he wasn't able to contact us. My father-in-law had already talked to my parents before calling me, just so my parents could come over if I needed it. I was in disbelief, honestly, just thinking about my husband, who was pretty much all alone. I had my parents, my son, and my in-laws. My husband had strangers. I found out later that my husband was not actually all alone, but there were people surrounding him at all times, making sure he was okay, which was very heartwarming. Other soldiers had been giving them their uniforms so he had clean clothes. They had given him different rucksack because his was full of ammo and he couldn't travel with this because he had been out on a mission. And people were making sure he had food, money, and calling cards. When Scott did arrive home later, he was gaunt. His skin had a green tone and he had lost a good deal of weight. You could see that he was deeply saddened in his soul. Holding our son was the best thing he could have. Our lives were about to be front page news for the world to see, and the usual homecoming was met with uncertainty of how to get through the next minutes of grief. We got through the funeral and the days after it with family and friends beside us, and then Scott had military stuff to take care of. Then he went back to his civilian job for a while, which wasn't really satisfying, so he worked with family. That was a hard transition. We moved to a house closer to his parents. Everyone in his hometown knew us because of the tragedy, and we were seen as those people, which was incredibly hard. My husband started having signs of frustration and anger, and one day took it out on the dog. Luckily, my husband and I had always had good communication, and I called him on it. I told Scott that he needed to go see someone about his frustration, and he went to the VA center and started therapy, which had amazing benefits for him and for us. He was able to heal and get the centering that he needed and the attention that he needed as well. Soon, Scott and I added 2 more kids to our family, pretty much back to back. In 2012, we added a girl. In 2013, we added a boy to our family and decided that was enough insanity for our lives. And all of this, Scott started his own business. We also realized that Connecticut, our home state, wasn't where we wanted to be anymore. The political landscape and the financial landscape was looking bleaker by the minute. The weather was horrible and the taxes were financially killing us. We made a decision to move across the country to Arizona, away from everything we knew, to restart our lives. Moving to Arizona wasn't without turmoil. A lot of people didn't understand our decision and frankly thought we were terribly misguided. My parents moved out with us immediately, and 2 years later, Scott's parents followed. Although we felt terribly alone, Arizona was the fresh start we needed for our family. People didn't know Scott as Stephen's brother, and Scott was able to start his business over. I was able to meet new people and find kinship with great people. I started a mom blog. Scott started more web development, and we also started homeschooling with our kids. Our family started going back to church, and we ended up on a better trajectory than we were before. We were saving money and enjoying our new surroundings. I learned through all of this that our communication was absolutely the most important thing. Scott and I would take time to talk about our problems, and we weren't afraid to call each other out on misbehaviors. We talk about what's going on with the kids constantly. If there's a situation with our parents, we talk about that too. We have been frustrated with each other before, but usually has been about miscommunication. While there is such thing as talking too much, you have to find peace with who you are with. Scott and I can be in the same room and be completely silent and comfortable. When we were dating, we both knew we were right for each other because we had that kind of relationship. Even early in our dating, we talked about what we were expecting from marriage and relationships because we had been burned before and we wanted a good relationship with each other. I think our communication has made it possible for us to continue to have a great marriage for almost 12 years. In 2018, I ended up getting sick. I brushed it off for a few days as thinking it was just a cold. Scott had to travel for work and I was homeschooling, so I do what moms do. I sucked it up. My parents and in-laws knew I wasn't feeling well, so they took the kids for a few hours each so I could get a little extra rest while Scott was away. When Scott came back, I was feeling better, so we went for a little staycation for our anniversary with the kids. September 1st would start off as an ordinary day. We all hung out as a family, but later in the day, I started to feel really sick and started throwing up. Scott was making dinner, but I told one of the children to get my husband. Scott rushed upstairs and I told him that I felt scared and nervous, like someone was coming to get me. Scott knew that this was not normal behavior and came and sat with me for a little bit. I couldn't snap out of this behavior, so he told the kids to get ready to get in the car. He got me in the car, and we drove to the hospital about 6 miles away. I continued to behave erratically.
Vicki,
Yes.
Vicki, excuse me.
Yeah.
We run out of time. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay. I'm so sorry to interrupt you. You got a
No problem.
tremendous story there, but we've run out of time, and I apologize. And
That's fine.
it's a tremendous story that you have there. A lot of people can relate to that. I got military in me and served a total of 31 years. Vietnam. My son served. He's still serving 22 years. He's a reservist. Multiple trips to the sandbox. So.
Yeah.
We have a lot in common. But anyway, before you go, would you be kind enough to share your website and your email with others so they can get in touch with you and hear more?
Yeah, so sorry. I messed up on that. I thought I had enough time. So it's surpriseazmom.com and Vicki at surpriseazmom.com. So VICKI at surpriseazmom.com.